Hello, everyone, and welcome again to the Teams track of the 2022 Canadian Cloud Summit. We are starting with Chris Hoard for our first session for securing apps in Dataverse for Teams. Chris, thank you again and welcome.
Hi, Mike. How you doing? Welcome, everyone, and welcome to this inaugural Canadian Cloud Summit event. You know, I was very excited when this came up because I know several MVPs from over in Canada. I've always wanted to do an event for them, and some of them speak for us at Teams Nation. So when the Canadian Cloud Summit first came up, I went away, schemed what I could come up with in order to make it to this event. So we're going to be talking about securing apps in Dataverse for Teams. My name is Chris Hoard. I'm Partner Education Lead of Fusion here in the UK, a very blustery UK. There's a hurricane that's about to hit this evening. So I was saying to Mike that hopefully the slates are going to stay on my roof. But before we get going today, I just literally want to shout out to the rest of the organisers and all of the sponsors for making this event possible. I myself, as part of Teams Nation, know the trials and tribulations, shall we say, of getting everyone to get together and speak, and all of the logistics that's involved. And it's a lot of work that goes into these things. So, you know, congratulations for a smooth launch for the team, and hopefully I'll be one of those perennial speakers that will be back here for many years to come. But you know, let's get on with the session today and what we can expect. We're going to break it down into three parts. Number one, what are Dataverse for Teams apps? We need to know what they are. We need to know what Dataverse for Teams is, because we need to know the things that we're going to talk about before we can get to the outcome. Number two, as defined by the title, it's all about securing those Dataverse for Teams apps. So we're going to look through a number of security strategies. We're going to look at them in the Microsoft 365 environment. So we're going to be kind of looking at different parts and seeing what we can do. And third of all, good to know and opportunities. So it's not all about today. There's things that you can go off and to do. I want to make it kind of quite clear from the outset that the security strategies that we're going to show today are going to be one, you know, or should I say several, but that's by no means the kind of the full list. I'm sure that you're going to have your own ideas, but this is to have the things that you really should be thinking about to have on your list about how you can secure Dataverse for Teams apps. When those three parts are taken together, the outcome is to identify methods how to secure apps which are deployed in Dataverse for Teams. In other words, I want you to be able to come away and understand several of these methods that you can go away and use them within your own deployments. This is a level 300 session. It's an advanced session. In other words, all that really means is that you have to have a little bit of preliminary knowledge to do with Microsoft Teams, Azure AD, the compliance center within inside Microsoft 365, and of course environments to do with the Power Platform. But you know, it's not going to get too deep, it's not going to get insanely deep, but it will go into talking about a little bit of detail. So that's the kind of level. If you haven't seen these things before, don't worry. I don't think it's going to be kind of difficult, or you're going to kind of lose yourself within it. Just think of it that it's a new area for you, and that you look forward to opening up, getting hands-on, because you can go ahead and deploy these Dataverse for Teams apps straight after this session if needed. In terms of scope, this is going to focus kind of on security across the Microsoft 365 stack. So it's not just about Teams, it's where can we apply the security to apply for Dataverse for Teams. In terms of demo, I'm going to try and get as hands-on as possible, a little bit kind of limited always with time in terms of getting really hands-on with it, but hopefully around somewhere between 30 to 50% of the session. Just with a caveat, everything that you see today, okay, including what's on the decks, I only normally put a tag on for about 4 to 6 weeks. Microsoft, as you know, has a habit these days of changing things day to day. So what you see one day might not be the same in another. So I normally just put it up to about 4 to 6 weeks. So all okay? Let's get underway and start looking at what Dataverse for Teams apps are. So I guess to the two sides of this, before we can get into the security strategies, is really understanding what Dataverse for Teams apps are, what Dataverse for Teams environments are, and how they work together, and what is it that we're trying to achieve. So very simply, Dataverse for Teams apps are applications that can be installed into a Dataverse for Teams environment. Now, you can either decide to build them completely yourself if you're a developer, but Microsoft over the last number of years have provided several Dataverse for Teams apps to install in Dataverse for Teams environments. They're also called sample apps. You might have called them template apps. Now, if I go into my Teams instance right here, you can see that I've installed a Dataverse for Teams app into the environment. This is a Dataverse for Teams app called Employee Ideas. Now, if I go inside Power Apps, so you can see that I've pinned Power Apps right there on the left-hand side. You can see a number of Dataverse for Teams apps right in front of you. It's right in this section here. There's 8 of them: Employee Ideas and Inspection and Issue Reporting and Bulletins and Milestones and Profile Plus and Boards and Perspectives. So Microsoft have already got a number of Dataverse for Teams apps ready to go inside the environment. And the purpose of this is Microsoft is that they are useful applications that you can use standalone. In other words, use them as they are. Or what you can do is you can develop them further with your own functionalities. You can extend them in order to kind of make them more useful to your organization. So those are Dataverse for Teams apps. Okay, there are several of them. Now they get installed into the Dataverse for Teams environment. Now, what is a Dataverse for Teams environment? Well, that's an environment that's specific for that team, that's used to store, manage, and share team-specific data, apps, and even flows within inside their environment. So, in other words, if I'm creating a Dataverse for Teams app within that team, if I'm installing it in that team, that app is going to be deposited in that Dataverse for Teams environment. Now, if we look at that, okay, so I'm going to go back into my lab. I've installed it into the team. You can see that this is the Employees Ideas app that I've installed into the team. And where's that actually stored? That's stored in a Dataverse for Teams environment that, if you can kind of almost imagine figuratively, is stored underneath that team, and you can access it through admin.powerplatform.microsoft.com. Now, when it comes, okay, to Dataverse for Teams environments, okay, there's a few things that we have to understand. Number one, it's a dedicated environment for each team. So imagine that I've got 2 teams, Team A and Teams B. I will have a Dataverse for Team environment for Team A. I will have a Dataverse for Teams environment for Team B. If I install an app into Team A, it's going to go into the environment of Team A. If I've got an app in Team B, that's going to be installed into the environment of Team B. Okay, so we could potentially have lots and lots of different Dataverse for Teams environments in our tenant. Secondly, 2 GB storage in each environment. What happens if we hit that limit? Well, we're going to have to start thinking about either removing things from that environment in order to free up the space, or we're going to have to convert it into full Dataverse. So we always have to be kind of, that's something that we must understand from the start. It's got, you know, a fixed amount of storage. It's also, if you look in docs.com, it has a fixed it has functionalities. A lot of people say that Dataverse for Teams environments are like Dataverse Lite. Okay, and there is limitations on the Dataverse for Teams environment compared to full Dataverse. And I'm sure that after this session, you can go off and compare. There's many great articles that are around by MVPs on the internet. Okay, you can also build and extend in Teams with Power App Studio. So you can use things like Power App Studio in conjunction with your Dataverse for Team environment. So we have our apps, we have our environments. In order to store those apps, how do we actually install? There's really 2 ways in which we can actually install a Dataverse for Teams apps. Number one, we can install it through the App Store. So if we go into Teams, we come down to apps on the left-hand side. We have our apps. We would search for one of these. So for example, Employee Ideas. So if I just start typing in, there we go, Employee Ideas. We click the button and then we add it into a team and it installs into the team. You also saw me through Power Apps. We can access them from there too. So again, if we click on Employee Ideas, we can add to a team. So we can install many of these Dataverse for Teams apps directly within the Teams UI. But also as well, we can also install some of them because some of them are not integrated into Teams. We can actually install them from GitHub. So in other words, we can get the zip file. If I go back out to my environment and I click on GitHub, here is one, okay, for the app boards. Now, if I go back to my Power Apps again, so I'm going to retry. Okay. So if I go back to Power and I click one of these ones that are in preview, so I'll click Perspectives, you will see that I will be taken out to GitHub. In order to be able to download the zip, which we can then install into the Teams Admin Center, all I need to do is click on the name, okay, and then click on the custom app, download it, and then install it into the Teams Admin Center. So there's a few different ways in which we can install Dataverse for Teams apps into the Teams, and hence when we create that first app, or if we create a Power Virtual Agent, say, it then creates the Dataverse for Teams environment. Now, all very simple, all very straightforward. However, you know, that is when the kind of the warning light should go on. There's some risks that we should kind of be aware of. I haven't got an exhaustive list. I'm just gonna roll out 3 examples. Number 1, if the apps are not controlled by anyone in the org, if the apps are not controlled, anyone in the org can install them into any team. So what I mean by here is that if I go back inside my environment and these apps aren't controlled whatsoever, then they will be available to all users within inside teams. You know, if you've got an organization that's got 1,000 teams and 1,000 users, then that's 1,000 teams who could start installing these apps and creating Dataverse for Teams environments all over the place. You know, that's something from a governance perspective that fills us with dread, but also as well from a security perspective, because the surface area of attack is potentially much larger than it is. Number 2, what if somebody outside our organization could easily access data in the app? Now, this app is going into Teams and is accessed through Teams. So we have to think about things in terms of what happens if people have mobile phones and they've got the Teams app on them. How are we going to secure them there? What happens if they've got premium Power Apps licensing, for example, and can access it over the web? Last but not least, the third scenario, if the app can be connected to other apps, then the data in the app could be leaked. So these Dataverse for Teams apps use what they call connectors in order to be able to connect them to other applications. So when we actually deploy that application into Teams and into the Dataverse for Teams environment, we have to then go and configure the connectors to stop other applications accessing them. I'll show you a little bit later of that in the session. But, you know, just discussing those 3 scenarios, it kind of brings to the foreground that we don't just want to have click, 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 and then start using the app without any thought about security or compliance whatsoever. This should kind of be inbuilt when we're doing the deployment of that application. We should be thinking about who needs to use it. Why do we use it? Do we even need that as part of our jobs? Because all those things are really, really important. So what we kind of need to do is we need to harden our security posture. We need to think about what things we can do in order to secure those applications. As said, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just a number of things from which I have worked on Dataverse for Teams apps. It's by no means the full list, and you will probably explore lots of other different things. But these are things that I think can help in the immediate future, particularly if you've already deployed these apps without thinking about these things. It might help you to walk back a little bit and kind of refocus and check and implement some of these things. So when it comes to security, we're really looking for a defense in depth strategy. In other words, what people want to get to in that app, what do they want? Normally they want data, and they want something that's important, some IP, something they can get about your users or your organization. And it doesn't necessarily have to be people outside the organization. It can be people inside it too. Now, what's got to feed into this is this idea of what's called CIA. So this little triangle down the bottom, if you work in security, you kind of know about CIA. CIA is what's called confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And it's always a trade-off. You know, you don't want to impede users being able to do the work, otherwise they're not going to use the app. But at the same time, you don't just want to make it available and not think about the other 2 things, not think about the protection of the data. So we go for a defense in depth strategy. And in Microsoft 365 world, that is not just in Teams, That's also in Azure AD. That's also in the actual app, the Dataverse for Teams app itself. That's on the environment that it's actually stored in. There is a number of things that we can do, but any one thing is not going to protect that data ultimately. We have to implement several of these things to slow the advance of the attacker or the agent trying to get to the data that sits within the app. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through all of these methods, okay, that you can implement inside your own environments when deploying these apps, and what things seem to work well. Again, I just want to reiterate that there could be other things as well that might already spring to your mind during this session. So we're going to go through Teams, we're going to go through Azure AD, and then we're going to go through the actual Dataverse for Teams app. Now, starting off within Teams in this focus area, I mean, it's the natural place to start. We're installing the app after all inside the Teams environment. And that really begins at what we call the app permissions policy. So if we go into the Teams admin center, so here I am inside the Teams admin center. I'm sure that for a lot of you, this is a pretty familiar interface. We go into the section Teams apps, and then we go on to app permissions. Now, I just want to show you, I've set up a custom app permission policy here. I've also set up or reconfigured the global org-wide default app policy. I just want to show you the difference between them. So in my organization, including Dataverse for Teams apps, I've given my administrators and Teams owner all permissions to allow all apps. Inside the global org-wide default, however, what I've actually done is I've actually blocked, okay, pretty much all users within inside my organizations from installing those Dataverse for Teams apps inside the environment. Why? Because I don't want hundreds of instances of these applications being in my environment. I also don't want several hundred potential Dataverse for Teams environments being created because people are installing these apps. If I was to install a Dataverse for Teams app, okay, if I come back into Teams itself, if I install a Dataverse for Teams app, okay, in this channel, which is the general channel, and I install another Dataverse for Teams app inside this communications compliance channel, then it's going to create two apps within inside my Dataverse for Teams environment. So it's really important that in order to be able to get some sort of control over these applications within inside the environment, we need to turn to app permissions policies and stop the people who do not need to install apps from being able to install apps. So within inside the Teams admin center, it's heavily recommended that you either create a block specific apps policy in order to stop them installing these instances, or turn it, for example, to an allow specific apps and block all others so that they're already included on the block list, and you have to be added to a custom policy that's going to allow you to actually install them into your environments. So that is kind of one observation, and that's something that helps these Dataverse for Teams applications being installed all over your environment. Secondly, you'll also notice how I've also added Power Apps, okay, onto this. Now, you would probably ask, why are you doing that? Because, okay, if I go back into the Teams environment and then I go to Power Apps, and this is where you actually have access to the tables within the application. So if I click on Build, okay, and I go to the installed apps that I've got, and you can see that there's a Dataverse for Teams app that I've installed inside my environment, and I click on See All, you actually have direct access through Teams to the tables of the application that when you start using it will have your data. So again, you have to ask yourself, how many people need access to this? How many people are going to be creating these access to it? So for me, I think it's quite important that if a user within inside the environment is in no way, shape or form creating those apps, needing access to those tables, then it really should go on an app permissions policy. We're trying to stop the users tampering with the app. We're trying to stop the user installing the team and creating Dataverse for Teams environments all over the place. So the app permissions policy is really important in the management of your Dataverse for Teams apps and environments within your tenant. Secondly, you've got the app setup policy. Now, this again, this is a quite important one. So if I come back up into my Teams environment, here I am, and then I click on setup policies in terms of app permission policies. If I go to the global org-wide default, you will see that the ability to upload apps, or what we call side loading, has been turned off. And you'll just want to make sure, okay, that that is only on users that you want to side load applications. Why? Because certain of these Dataverse for Teams apps, as said, are actually on GitHub and not fully installed into Microsoft Teams. So if you've got side loading turned on, for example, you will be able to side load these apps into the environment. And what you don't want doing is people running, for example, those own apps because they've installed them as zip files into their instance of Microsoft Teams. I know that to an extent you can control that, but you just want to kind of check inside your environment that only the right people are enabled for side loading inside their app setup policy. It helps users get in sample apps or other apps that third parties have created and start kind of using them with inside their environment. You want to get of course you want the side loading to be enabled, but only for the right people who are testing the applications inside your environment. Next, okay, we kind of come out of the Teams admin center, and then we kind of hung down a little bit. And this is all about really just being mindful of the teams that we actually installed them in, us as owners of those teams. So role is very important in Dataverse for Teams apps because the permissions of the app is dependent upon the role that you have within a team. So if I come within the team and I select my team, here is my team. If I click those three dots and I click manage team, you can see that you've got three owners here, Chris, Vesku, and Adam. Haven't got any members, but whether you're an owner or a member matters when it comes to Dataverse for Teams apps, because owners have basically God permissions. They have all the settings, they can access all the tables of that Dataverse for Teams app within inside their environment. So if you've got lots of people who are owners of a team, you might need to adjust these permissions because you don't want them to have full access over the Dataverse for Teams app. So the team member's role is really important, both in terms of permissions, both in terms of functionality. So you're going to want to make sure that those are correct, and whatever team that you install that in, you want to make sure that the roles are right. Secondly, it's also about the kind of the position of the application within inside the team and within inside the environment. In other words, I install the app into my team, but I don't want other members of the team going and then suddenly moving it between channels or being able to just remove the tabs that app is on and then one day it disappears. So as team owners, it's our responsibility to really come in when we manage the team, come into the settings, and then member and guest permissions, we want to be able to change. So what I'm just going to do here is I'm just going to turn all of these off. In that way, I know that that app is in the same channel, in the same place that I left it when I actually set it up. So we have to take into control, right, both who's got permissions on these apps, who can actually see these apps within inside their environment, and then we need to establish control over the team that we install that in and have stakeholdership by the owner of that team. Another way that we can control and block access to the app is by controlling guests. Now, one of the most well-known thing about Teams is that we can have guests inside our environment. What we can actually do in order to block guests completely out of the team, because when guests was first introduced into Teams, it was problematic for people because you could simply turn it on, turn it off, and it had to be one or the other. And then along came sensitivity labels, where if we add a sensitivity label to a team, that can actually block guest access. It can also as well require manage devices in order to be able to connect to that team and hence connect and use the resources within it. Now, unfortunately, we haven't got time today to go through all of that process, but I just want to kind of show you here. So here I am inside the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center. And I've got information protection down here on the left-hand side and labels. And you can see that for this demonstration, I've created a label right here called D4T, which is, just stands for Dataverse for Teams. And when we create that, you can see that its scope is set to a site. Now, if I edit that label for a second and I just scroll through the menu here, so I'm just scrolling for a second. Next one. Okay. You can see here we go, about the external user access settings. I have turned them off here. So in other words, guests are not allowed to access this environment whatsoever. If my app's a sensitive app, I'm just going to go back into Teams. And if I go back into Ideas, where that app actually lives, this Employee Ideas app, this Dataverse for Teams app, could be something really, really sensitive, such as this is the ideas for our organization, for our senior leadership team, for our finance department. We do not want anyone outside of our organization being able to step anywhere near that app. So applying a sensitivity label to the actual team is a surefire, easy way to block any guest from outside that team. I've actually just set up a team, and as you can see here, it's actually got the label that's right next to it. So guests are not allowed into that team inside my environment, even though they are allowed into this team here, which is called Modern Work. Very easy to be able to add labels. You enable MIP labels in PowerShell. You create that labeling policy as you kind of saw what I did inside the Compliance Admin Center. And then you sync to Microsoft 365 groups within PowerShell. Those labels should appear when creating teams in order for you to add to them or when you edit a team. So there's just 3 very simple ways within Teams. We're now going to move on to Azure AD. So this is all about identity. This is all about having a strong front door, because it's not just about things you can do within Teams. This is also about things about how you access Teams itself, through which you access the app. Now, this is probably pretty well known to us, but it's always worth recommending. We can shout out anywhere. The first one is multi-factor authentication. Everyone who uses that app should be using multi-factor authentication without a shadow of a doubt. I think it's probably pretty widespread these days, but as Microsoft, they give the statistic 99.9% of identity-based attacks. Very easy to go and enable within the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. So here I am, my active users. I click on multi-factor authentication, and then it's as easy as clicking on one of my users and then enabling it. Enable multi-factor authentication. Then when they log in, they will be asked to then enroll within multi-factor authentication, and you will provide them with something such as the Authenticator app in order to be able to authenticate. Recommended. Let's get everyone who's using kind of apps and with sensitive stuff in them beyond just simple username and password. So that, okay, is multi-factor authentication, something you know, something you have, something you are. But it's very quickly we're moving towards conditional access. So we're bolstering the multi-factor authentication with conditional access. This allows us to control what devices access Teams, where you can actually access Teams from. If it's a really sensitive app, we might want to lock down the access of Teams to certain locations, depending upon if you're using that app or not. Now I'm going to jump into Azure AD, and within Azure AD, again, I'm sure this is all pretty familiar to everyone who's on the call. I've set up an example policy whereby multi-factor authentication needs to be used and where the device needs to be compliant. In that way, it's enrolled within Intune, multi-factor authenticator is used, and the right devices, so the right people should be accessing Teams and that app. I've included this for specific users. So this is one of the guys in my environment, Chris Webb. I've set the conditional access policy to be for Microsoft Teams. And then I will grant access on 2 controls multi-factor authentication is required, and I've required the device to be marked as compliant. If they do not have them, they are not getting in. So they have to, so it's not just about multi-factor authentication, it's about placing if this, then that arguments on top of that to say, if you want access to this app, you have to meet a certain number of conditions in order to be able to access it. Again, I really hope that conditional access is becoming the benchmark for you. You do need, however, Azure AD P1 and above in order to be able to access that. But you can grant users that's based upon users, risk, location, device, or application. It's very, very flexible, but very, very powerful at the same time. So these are almost benchmarks that we want for a strong front door. In addition, we can use security groups for what we call broad distribution scenarios. Now, I just need to explain this a second, okay? Because with the Dataverse for Teams app, you saw me install it inside the environment. I installed it inside this team. Here's the app, as you can see it there. But the most powerful thing about Dataverse for Teams apps is that you can share them with people in your organization outside of your team. Now, how do we actually do that? Let me show you. Here inside, okay, teams and groups within inside my my Microsoft 365 Admin Center. I go to Active Teams and Groups. I then go to Security Groups and create a security group. And you can see I've created one here called D4T Broad Distribution. If I click on it, I can see by the members that everyone, okay, in my org is in that list. Now, back within Microsoft Teams, I then go to Power Apps. This is as the owner of, and the person who installed the app. I then, okay, go to Build, and I look at my installed apps. There's my my Dataverse for Teams apps, and then I go to Share with Colleagues. And you can see that I've shared with that security group, okay? So I've shared this app with that security group. Now, everyone who is in that distribution group, no matter if they're in the team or not, will be able to access this application from the left-hand app row. And so by using the security group, we can tightly control people outside of that team who need access to be able to use this application. That's pretty cool, right? Because some of these applications can work really well across environments. Imagine we could install a Dataverse for Teams app like Employee Ideas, where that ideas board can go around your whole organization. It's amazing, right? But you control that broad distribution with the security group. So that's quite just important to know that if you do extend that app outside, you do not need to expose it to the outside world. You can simply use a security group and then share it with the people inside that security group, and they can then open it within Teams. Now, moving on to the final part, we look about the app controls. So this is what's in Dataverse for Teams apps, but also as well within Power Platform in the environment. The first thing to call out is that some Dataverse for Teams apps have inbuilt controls. The one that I've installed, Employee Ideas, has inbuilt app controls. So if I go into the team, you'll see that I've got 2 tabs. So it's actually 2 apps as opposed to one that's installed. And the management app is this one called Manage Ideas. If I click on it, and if I'm the owner, I will then see a cog on the right-hand side of this app. And if I click on it, I then have some controls that are inbuilt into the app, which I can utilize. The examples here in this application, I can restrict certain settings from normal members who have access to that app. I can also determine where the notifications goes. Then they're nothing much, but they're still there for the owners as opposed to the members of the team when using the application. And this can lock them down to doing things like not add campaigns within inside this app or not access the settings. We want to make sure as owners that we interrogate all this functionality, and especially where some of it can be restricted like it can here. So if the app does have inbuilt controls, explore them, get familiar with the application, because those can be used to lock down users doing certain things within the application. Next, we've got two more things to finish off. Number one, this is table permissions. So this is probably one of the most important one, because it's tables and the permissions upon those tables that can determine what you can actually do in the app. I'm going to show you this. I'm going to get there and then I'm going to explain it. So I go to Power Apps. So where I mentioned the tables before, I go into the Power Apps application. I then click on Build. I then click on Installed Apps. I then click on See All. And here are all of the tables where all of your data is held, whether you write something in the app, whether you remove something, whether you modify, that is working with the tables underneath the applications. And we can control the permissions on here. So this is an employee idea app. I want the ability to be able to create ideas. That's what's defined in this table here up the top. And if I click on the three little buttons, right, and go to edit data, again, the tables will come on the left-hand side. And then what I do is I manage the permissions. You can control permissions at a table level, at a tabular level, and different sets of people at that. So in other words, you want some people to be able to create ideas in that app? Great. You want some people not to create campaigns in that app? Great. You want some people to be able to raise questions in that app? Great. You can control at a table level what your users can and can't actually do. And that's also important as well, just in case somebody was to get inside your environment and try to get to the data in those tables, try to destroy it out the app if you have like an insider threat. So you can see here that the owner, which is the owner of the team, has full access to do everything. It's grayed out. It's just, that's how it's designed. But everyone else, members of the team, guests, or even the people you shared it with, you can decide what they can and what they can't do. So members of the team, I don't want them having full access. I don't want them to delete their own entries from that application. So I'm going to give them collaborate permissions instead, and then I'm going to save it and move forward. So table permissions are really important in terms of security, and you go through, have a look at them, look what you want different sets of people to be able to do. But there are some things that you have to keep in mind with table permissions. Okay, number one, those tables are only accessed via Power Apps. Let's just go back and see that again. In Power Apps, not in the actual app itself. You will never get to the tables through the actual Dataverse for Teams app. You've got to go via Power Apps. Number two, who can access the tables is determined by the app permission policy. In other words, whoever is permitted by the app permission policy in Microsoft Teams is allowed to get into Power Apps. Then they have to be an owner of the team to access the table. So that, you know, it is quite deep from a permissions perspective. There is some limitations. You can't granulate permissions for two people within the same role. You can granulate permissions between different roles. So whether you're an owner, whether you're a member, whether you're a guest, yes, you can, but not different people within that. Let's say I had 5 members and they all wanted different permissions. I can't granulate it that far. Okay. If you do allow guests in the environment, you can also define what they can and can't do in the app, as said, and there is no ability to have custom permission sets. So you saw us have those permission sets in the table. So let's go back to it. I managed permissions. I cannot create a custom permission set on top of that. So in some ways, we do still have some limitations, because whilst we've got lots of ways we can play around with permissions, also as well, if we do play around with permissions, we do start having a problem with standardization too. So that's just something we have to bear in mind. So just finishing up, right, okay, onto the last point. We also have data loss prevention. I mentioned something called connectors. You can connect your Dataverse for Teams apps to other apps, both within your environment and also in different Microsoft tenants, or even to third-party applications outside your environment. This poses quite a big risk because essentially, if we misappropriate connectors, we could have a data leakage on our hands. So Microsoft introduced something called data loss prevention so that we could stop and block connectors so that data would not leak out to other applications. It could be a developer that accidentally configures it or does it maliciously. So we want to make sure that we have control over this so that we don't have data leakage into other applications. So this time we come out of Teams. We don't need the Microsoft 365 environment anymore. We actually go into the Power Platform admin center, admin.powerplatform.microsoft.com. In here is where our environments are. And we go down to policies, and then we go down to data policies. Okay, you can see that I've already created a policy. This is called an employee ideas policy. So I'm just going to edit this policy and show you what I've done. I've named the policy. I've then configured the connectors. So we have all these connectors that are there. I've blocked some of them by default. I do not want any data in my app going to Salesforce, going to Dropbox, going to Asana. Okay, I can go back to the default list. I can say, for example, I don't want it to go to 365 training, for example. Click block, and then it goes on the block list. I then go through, complete, okay, and set the environment where my Dataverse for Teams app installed in. They should be the same name as the team that you installed it in. So you can see that I've already got my modern work, which is my modern, if I go back to the Teams, my modern work team where the app is installed in. I click next, and then I update the policy. So that's just adding or blocking, shall I say, another connector. So you'll want to make sure that you're familiar with this data loss prevention and be able to have that configured before you start using your app. You do not want data leakage going outside of your apps. Microsoft have recently, since I did this, I've only done this once before this topic, but when I did it last year, it didn't have this functionality. Microsoft have brought in something called tenant isolation. So if we go in here inside the environment, you will see data or tenant isolation. In other words, you can block all connectors going in and out of your tenant, out of your Microsoft tenant from any other tenant within Microsoft. You know, think about it as ring fencing your particular tenant, and that connectors can't come in from outside or go outside with this called tenant isolation. And you can configure tenant rules to allow specific connectors to go in and out. So I'd kind of recommend to have this tenant isolation up unless you specifically need to go out or let a connector through to your Dataverse for Teams application. So just to sum up, we've gone through some of these, like we identified some of these risk scenarios. Number one, if the apps are not controlled by anyone in the org, can install them into any team. In other words, it's not going to be a free-for-all just installing hundreds of these Dataverse for Teams applications anymore, because we have smartly used app permission policies and app setup policies, and also as well we're configuring our teams right so that not anyone can install any Dataverse team app inside their environment. We're avoiding sprawl. We're kind of limiting the attack surface area. So yes, we're good on that perspective. What if somebody outside your organization could easily access data in the app? Well, we're using multi-factor authentication. We're using conditional access. We're using security groups in order to control who's actually using our application and the, you know, kind of the right roles within the team. That's great. If the app can be connected to any other apps, then the data in the app could be leaked. Well, we're now using data loss prevention and tenant isolation. So there really, hopefully, isn't as much of a fear of that as we did previously. So look, you know, these things are giving us the tools. I'm not saying it's going to protect everything, but it's going to protect you against certain situations and make your posture harder, and it's going to be more difficult to get to the data in your app. Some good to know and some opportunities just to finish up. If you want to look at your app usage for Dataverse for Teams apps, you can do so within the Teams Admin Center by going and looking at the app usage. If you don't know where that is, then if I jump up to Teams, okay, and you go to the analytics and reports, and you can see it there through the usage report. Okay, so that's one place you might want to look afterwards. In addition, you've got the COE starter kit. Now you can install that into a Dataverse for Team environment. I think it was Jukka Narayanan, I think, from Finland, who wrote a blog on that. I've not got around to trying this myself because it's been so busy this year, but I will do in the future for sure in the next couple of months. So I'd recommend it because it's got so much good stuff in the COE starter kit, but also as well, it's got lots of, kind of auditing and monitoring capabilities, which you'll want to get some of that in place for your Dataverse for Teams apps. And then, of course, if you go beyond that 2 gig of storage, you can upgrade to Dataverse, and that should unlock some other security capabilities, such as the encryption key and also custom roles as well. Again, that's something that I would like to get hands on with a lot in the future. Returning to outcomes. What are Dataverse for Teams apps? Number one, okay, they are apps that we install into Dataverse for Teams environments. They've been provided by Microsoft, and there are several of them. Some of them are in the Teams Admin Center. Some of them are on GitHub. We've looked at security strategies for those applications. We've looked at various aspects of Teams, such as app permission policies and app setup policies. We've looked at Azure AD, multi-factor authentication, conditional access and security groups. We've also looked at the apps themselves with inbuilt controls, and also as well data loss prevention and tenant isolation. Then there's some opportunities after this session in order to be able to go on and explore other things, because believe me, there is so much more else to look at. Hopefully over the course of the last 45 minutes, we've come to identify methods how to secure apps, more specifically Dataverse for Teams apps, which are deployed in Dataverse for Teams environments. I hope you've enjoyed the session. This has been a level 300 session. Like I say, we've dived into some of the detail, around it. In terms of a scope, we wanted to have it on security as opposed to any one of the services. In terms of demo, I've tried to keep it as much as possible. I think it was 30 to 50%. I said in that first slide, but here it says 40 to 50. And just remember, things move very, very fast. So I wouldn't be surprised whether things might look slightly different in 4 to 6 weeks' time. But I just want to say thank you. I've really loved being here, and I think it's now on to the questions. I'm presenting this, funny enough, for the same tomorrow, but so it's good that I won't have to rebuild the demo environment from scratch tonight. But I'd like to thank you all ever so much for coming. Thank you to the host. Thank you to all the sponsors for coming. And Mike, I think we're pretty much there. Please feedback in order to win a chance at a reward. I hope you came away and learned something. I hope you found it interesting. It's a lovely subject when you get into it and you get hands-on with it. So yeah, really, really lots to explore.
Thank you. That was great, actually. We have the actual questions in the chat if you want to go through them, if you want me to read them to you or you want to read them yourself.
Okay, yeah, what I'll do is I'll stop presenting my screen. Okay. Let's just go through a couple of these. Okay. All sessions will be recorded. Great. We'll have Q&A. Perfect. Okay. Does the Dataverse for Team app consume storage space in our tenant? So if I have 1 gigabyte, can I still create a Dataverse for Team? Each Dataverse for Team environment, okay, has 2 gigabytes of space, and when you can fill it up with multiple apps, you can fill it up with flows, you can fill it up with Power Virtual Agents, but when it hits that limit, then you will get a warning that you need to go beyond that that data limit. So you would either do one of 2 things. You'd either uninstall some stuff out of it, or what you would do is that you would convert to a normal Dataverse environment. So you would kind of scale up. And you know, if you're going to be putting a lot of apps in there, then that will probably be the choice that you have. Alternatively, you'll want to do a comparison between Dataverse for Teams and Dataverse, because it could have some features on there that you want, or some extra some security functionality. So hopefully that's done your session. Okay, can guest users use the apps deployed in a team? Yes, and as you saw by the table, guests can actually use those applications. In terms of security, I gave the example of not wanting guests within inside the team. So we can use sensitivity labels, but by all means, you can have guests. Okay, Jennifer, if MFA is on and the user has MFA to access Teams, will they need to re-MFA when they go onto the tab with the app? The answer to that is no. Okay, so once you've used MFA and you go into Teams, it should kind of open with like any other application. There's not, you won't basically have to authenticate again, unless, for example, you've lost connectivity, come back to the to a web browsing session, and then it goes out and then you have to log on again. Okay, is there any way to get a report of which set groups have access to which apps, or vice versa? No, that's a bit of a difficult one. That is probably, it might be something that the COE can have in it, but do you know what? I doubt it. But what I will say is that you can only have one group about which you can have that broad distribution scenario. Okay, so it's just a singular group. So that helps in terms that you can't have hundreds of teams to share that application within that broad distribution scenario, but you don't unfortunately have a report. So what you might want to do now, you might create like a common security, like kind of security group, such as D for T apps, for example, at domain, and then share several different apps with them out that way. If you've got a small enough organization where you want like roughly the same people to do it, but you would have to make a call on that. Okay, is there any way to get okay? Could wish that the manage tab were invisible to regular users instead of just locked. Jennifer, was that the manage ideas? Is which context do you mean that in? Do you want to come off mute, Jennifer?
She can't unless we promote her.
Okay. Do you quickly want to type what you meant by that point, Jennifer, in there? Do you wish that the manage tabs were invisible to regular? Do you mean that the manage ideas as opposed to the idea, if you get me? They all have user tabs and manage tabs. You can, they're two. If you look at it like, let me just share my screen again. I'll actually show you. Okay, so get this. Okay, I noticed that when I started doing this, with you have the manage tabs and you have the ideas tab. If you go inside the Power App, okay, and then you go to build and you go to the installed apps, as you'll see, it's actually two apps as opposed to. Now, what you can actually do is, for just give you an example, let's say I've got an admin team. I can have the, I can potentially put the I can remove this if I want. So I'm going to remove this. So that from a user's perspective, they only have this. Then, okay, you could, I think it's it, look, you could have manage up here on this side for you as the administrator, as opposed to your users actually seeing those managed apps, and that would probably give you a bit of a cleaner experience. Is that something like kind of what you meant? Okay. So Nick, just before, because I know that we've got some time left. Okay, will you share your deck? There's a lot to absorb. Yeah, absolutely. You can. I'll pass it on to Mike. Great, awesome. That's got it. Looking forward to reviewing it. Thank you ever so much, David. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I think, you know what, I think that's everything. So I hope you enjoyed it, everyone. I hope you come along. There's 9 apps to play with, you know, have a look at all 9 of those apps because they're all very good in themselves. Okay, Microsoft done a great job with these sample apps. And as said, these Dataverse for Teams apps, they're half built. So you can use them standalone, or alternatively, you can develop them even further. But I hope that you've enjoyed today. I hope you kind with this feedback, and I look forward to hearing about the feedback. But Mike, anything else?
No, that was awesome. That was really, really good. Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it.
No worries at all. Well, have a great day, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the summit. Thanks, Mike, and thanks to the team for inviting me, and hope to see you again.
Thank you, Chris.